is not only the proud mum to 10-year-old Gabriel, she's also a motivational speaker, and she's author of this book, The Survival Guide to Parenthood Through the Eyes of a Single Mother. Welcome, Bev, and thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Single motherhood. When did your journey start?
It started at 16 weeks. Pregnant, single mother.
Why?
Because it was a marriage that was becoming a very difficult place to remain in, and I realized that if I stayed in it, I was going to be bringing this unborn child into a very complex relationship, and I couldn't see how that was going to be beneficial, and I was crumbling, and I didn't want to fall apart completely before the birth happened, and so it was time. It was a desperate move at a desperate time, and I made it.
You say it's a desperate move, and to walk away from financial stability, because a partnership very often does give that.
Absolutely.
With a 16-week fetus, when you've never parented before, what was your next port of call? Where did you go? Who did you turn to?
I went for therapy. I went for support. I turned to my friends. I contacted my family who weren't here and clung to family who are here, and slowly but surely started to look at all the choices I made that got myself into that, to really begin to rebuild on a solid ground, because it wasn't solid. It was like a squashed pawpaw. That's what I felt like, a squashed pawpaw.
I can't imagine that a squashed pawpaw has a lot of self-esteem.
No.
Did that play a big role for you?
It was a huge part of what my learning became about, that my self-esteem was pushed so far under the table that I allowed the choices to stay in the marriage, to keep trying in a relationship that clearly wasn't working. And self-esteem is the only thing that supports us, and it's our internal resource. And when I realized how little of it I had access to, I started to delve into that and started to look for it and find it and rebuild it.
Out of crisis, obviously, comes triumph. You've got your beautiful son.
I do.
Tell me how you used what had happened to you as a resource. How you grew as a person. Because you say you realized you didn't have the self-esteem, you realized that your confidence was in tatters. But how did you make that work for you?
When I first came out of the marriage, I thought that what we go through is who we become.
Okay.
And so I think a lot of people, and I certainly was doing that, kept living as a victim. And not necessarily a victim of my husband, a victim of a complex marriage, a victim of decisions to stay in it, a victim of my own choices and lack of self-esteem. And until I began to realize that there's two separate entities going on there. There's me as a human being with my internal values and my abilities and my esteeming of myself, and then there's the experiences I'm going to have. And the one has nothing to do with the other. I don't become less valuable because I have a hard marriage, and I don't become less valuable because I'm hijacked, and I'm not less valuable or less able to be generous and kind and loving because somebody says I don't like your hair. And the more I realized this and the more I learned about this, the more passionate I became about mentoring self-esteem, teaching it for others and growing it in myself. And the more that's happened, that has been I'd suppose the catalyst for it was this very trying divorce period.
Well, let's go back a little bit, because you got divorced, then you had Gabriel.
Yes.
And then you were hijacked. And you say that out of the hijacking, out of this, you grew this self-esteem as a resource. Tell me about the hijacking. One of the most traumatic things to happen to anyone, single or not.
Absolutely.
What
and
happened?
Certainly with children involved, there's even more of a helplessness involved, because they arrived in the driveway from nowhere. I was checking on a cat that was lying in our driveway, and I'd just reversed past it, and it was dead. They hadn't put it there. I found out afterwards, but then suddenly they were there, and my car, in intelligence, I suppose, or the lack thereof, was switched on, aimed outwards, with my son in his piccolo strapped firmly, safely in the front seat.
8 months old.
Yes, 8 months old, and they rushed in and took over, and suddenly I just thought, you know, it was just so overwhelming. If it was just me and my son was out of the car, no matter what was in the car, it would be goodbye, little old Golf, you know, off you go.
But you couldn't leave it.
Not a chance.
So
and
what did you do?
I landed up fighting with them, and the one guy ran behind me and put a gun at my head, and the other one jumped into the car, and they had to still get out our driveway, which the car was only 3-4 meters from the end of the driveway, aimed out. But I stood in front of the car, ran away from the man who was holding me, and I stood in front of the car and pushed the car, and he and I started arguing. I said, just give me the baby, just let me have the baby, please, I'm begging you, give me the baby. And he wouldn't. And repeatedly he kept saying, no, move. And I was like, no, please, just let me have the baby, you can have the car. I mean, seriously, that car, if I had had the money at the time, would have been replaced. It needed replacing, so take it. But that's not quite
So what did
happened.
they do?
They drove the car forward. He bumped the car forward, and
So he hit you with the car?
he hit me with the car 4 times.
4 times, and you still stood your ground?
I fell onto the ground and got up again, but it was just, there was something inside that just killed me, but you're not taking him without that fight.
So how did you get your baby out if they hit you 4 times with the car?
The 4th time they hit me so hard that they had bumped me backwards, obviously. They hit me so hard, he obviously had lost patience, as if he had it to start with, who knows. But he obviously lost it, and he hit me so hard and drove out into the street, waiting for his friend to get into the back, because his friend was behind me.
Okay.
So when his friend got into the car, I was on the street, because I'd been hit by the car, and I fell over the side of the car into the street.
Okay.
And I just screamed at him. I said, look, please, please just give me the baby. I'll do anything, give me the baby. And he looked back and he said, I don't care about your baby, I'm going to kill the baby. And I have no idea how the next few things happened, but the next thing I remember seeing was the keys for the car. So somehow, with them driving up the road, I'd managed to get up and get into the car on his lap in the front seat and have my eyes on the keys. And I pulled the keys out, threw them, and he was beating my son up. He was smashing him against the piccolo like a rag doll, just beating him. And I went insane, I think, in that moment. My mind stretched so far beyond any kind of normal framework. And then he beat me up, he threw me out, and he threw my son out. And then when I got up off the ground, I didn't know my son was thrown out. I ran back to the car, and they were gone. The handbrake was up, which I thought was generous of them.
Gabriel was gone.
And Gabriel was gone, and I thought, they've got him. But when I looked up the street, they were running empty-handed, and then I heard him screaming behind me on the street, and there he was.
Now, I know that must have been unbelievably traumatic for you, but did you feel a sense of power? Because I'm feeling your power just listening to it.
In the moment, I collapsed afterwards. A neighbor came running down. I picked up Gabriel and I clung to him, and a neighbor came running down the road, and I just collapsed into his arms. And then came everything afterwards. I didn't even realize what had happened to my leg. I had so much adrenaline running through my body that night at the hospital they did CAT scans on him and all the tests, and his brain was intact, and he had a huge swelling on the side of his head, but that was it.
And you?
And his neck muscles and his back muscles were strained. The peds saw him, and that was the story. And I wasn't really even checked out. And only 3 days later did we realize how much trouble I was in, because my leg stiffened into a rod. The muscles were torn right to the bone in my right leg, and it took about 6 months of intensive physio to walk properly again without limping. But we didn't even pay attention to it. He had a concussion. He was vomiting for 2 days, clinging to me like a life raft, and it was an interesting time.
But when you look back on it now, aren't you proud of yourself?
Immensely, and so grateful that was my response.
Because you saved your baby's life.
I believe I played a role in that, no question, and it's such a overwhelming reward.
And today he's this gorgeous 10-year-old,
Yes,
and you're
yes.
helping and motivating other single moms who probably went through the same fears, the same guilt, the same emotions as you.
Absolutely.
What has been your greatest challenge, and what has been your greatest triumph over the past 10 years?
I think my greatest challenge has been the incessant need to be present. That's unrelenting, there's no break, really. So I developed a strategy for that at the third or fourth call through the night, because my son for the first 6 months was up every 45 minutes to 90 minutes. And I just thought, you've got to be kidding. This is hard enough as it is. So I started to develop this pseudo partner, and I would like look at my pillow after the third time I was getting woken up and say, it's your turn.
Honey.
You get him, I'll come next time. And then after I had a bit of a laugh, then I'd go do it. And so for me, the challenge has been, parent evenings alone in an entire standard where every other child has both parents present. And it's been school meets alone and parties alone and entertaining alone. And it's been all of that.
But your triumph?
My triumph has been coming through it with a greater sense of self and dignity and a beautiful respect for who I've become and a love for myself and an honoring and not making choices that don't serve me and not allowing people into my relationships and my life who do not serve me. So now from 50 feet I can spot a relationship that's not a good idea, and being able to mentor that from a self-esteem perspective for other people and for my son, and to watch him growing with the self-esteem and with all those skills is just such a beautiful thing to see, and to help others and mentor them so their children grow that way is spectacular for me.
Well, before I let you go, for a single mother watching this who's down in the dumps and perhaps hating herself and wondering where she went wrong that this happened, what would be your best advice?
Let yourself cry. Give yourself permission to feel like it's just too much to cope with. And then when you've cried out for a while, find something about it that you can take that's humorous, and ask yourself, like, what's laughable about this? Because sometimes wanting to feed a family and just not having enough to feed them with 10 years down the line is humorous and sad at the same time. It's like, I had that once. And the best I can say is, in a nutshell, cry, laugh, give yourself permission to feel overwhelmed, and then begin again and draw from your resources and slowly rebuild in each situation.
Bev's book is called The Survival Guide to Parenthood Through the Eyes of a Single Mother. It's available in all good bookstores. Thank you, Bev. I strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic read. After the break, a single mum who followed through on her child's right to maintenance, going to the courts to ensure her ex-boyfriend did the right thing.